So Immanuel Kant then called it the teleological argument, from the Greek word hotelos, which means purpose or end. So the basis of the design argument is, or at least the start of it, is the observation that there are things that are made by human hands that are complicated, like the pen you're holding, like these things we're all carrying on us, right? So, I know, I hate the cold. Want me to save you $1,500 to $2,000? If you ever wondered what it is to visit the British Isles, here it is, folks. I was over there in 1985, and it was like this in August. I had, out of 3 weeks, I had 2 days without rain. Because they're an island nation, for one, plus they have the Gulf Stream coming up. London, England, is actually farther north than Moscow. But what keeps it from having the climate of Moscow is that, current that comes all the way from the Bahamas over across the Atlantic and warms it up, but that kind of stuff also produces a lot of rain. So anyway, so this is how it was like in August. Yeah, well, I was over there in 85 and 95 doing academic conferences at the University of Dublin and the University of Aberdeen. Not Aberdeen, Maryland, right? The Aberdeen. Anyway, so the design argument then, we'll see this in Aquinas' little simple presentation of it, starts with the observation that there are things we use that serve a purpose, and they didn't just get that way, right? The cell phones that you have with you, the pens you're writing with, didn't just get produced by nature that way. They were designed and built to serve that purpose, right? And basically, it says, well, you know what? There are complicated things in nature that, just like our cell phones and our pens and other things we use, that seem to show the same marks of design in that they have complicated parts that work together to serve a purpose. But here, if we're talking nature, you can say, well, who would the designer of things in nature be other than the designer of the universe, i.e. God? So that's so most people portray this as what is called an argument from analogy. An argument from analogy says, well, two things are alike in some respects, and that's your premise, the observation that they're alike in certain ways. And what you're doing is you're concluding from that there must be at least one further way that they are alike. And we'll see that the design argument basically observes similarities between products we make for our own use and things in nature, saying, well, they're alike in some respects, having complicated parts that work together to serve a purpose. And so the analogy says, well, if both things in nature and the products of human design have complicated mechanisms that enable something to serve a particular end or purpose, hence the word telos, or purpose, for the teleological or design argument, then analogously, if the things that we use that have complicated parts that work together to serve a particular purpose, like enabling us to write on paper or enabling us to make a phone call, then if these items needed a designer, then what about the complicated things in nature? Things like the ear and the eye that seem to have parts that work together to serve a purpose. Shouldn't they have needed a designer as well? I mean, we're going to go through this in some detail, but you know, just to sort of introduce it and sketch out briefly how the argument goes. You know, most people then portray it as an argument from analogy that makes an analogy between designed products that we use and you know, things found in nature that seem to have very similar characteristics. So Aquinas,
Is it so? It would be nature versus the human design?
Well, no. What we're saying is, because there seems to be a similarity between some things in nature and some design products that we use, namely they seem to have complicated mechanisms that work together to fulfill a function or purpose, then we're saying, well, just as things we use didn't just get that way, they needed to be designed and built to serve those purposes. So why shouldn't we think that things in nature are that way, you know, and that the complicated things in nature that have parts that work together to fulfill a function needed a designer as well? And then, of course, the argument concludes that the designer of things in nature must be the author of nature, you know, the maker of the universe, i.e. God, as God is traditionally conceived. So Aquinas, in his very long theological book, devotes about 2 pages to arguments from nature. Sometimes this area is called natural theology. In fact, Paley's book, from which that selection in your text was taken, was called natural theology. The idea is let's suppose we lay aside any revelation, like the Bible, whether Old or New Testament, even things like the Book of Mormon or some other revelation. What could we maybe tell about whether or not God exists just from observations about nature? Hence natural theology. And for most professional theologians, these arguments are not the prime basis for their faith, right? I like to think of them as arguments that they hold to be much like icing on the cake, right? They're more concerned about to have their faith based on, what they believe is a revealed faith, but the Bible and church tradition, but that you also have these other arguments you can construct as kind of icing on the cake. It's so Aquinas has 5 ways. They're all a posteriori arguments. That is, they're all arguments based on observations about the world. None of them are abstract abstract arguments like the ontological argument, a priori arguments. And the first 3 are a kind of rehashing of arguments that Aristotle first got out. They're versions of what is called the cosmological argument. Which says basically that a necessary first cause was needed for the cosmos, for the universe, hence cosmological, namely God. Right? In other words, these are the arguments from first cause. I'm not going to worry about the 4th way, but the 5th way is a very simple early statement of the design argument. And so it's of interest historically. And so this is Aquinas' 5th way. The 5 ways, then, are 5 ways to prove God's existence from nature. And so he says, things in nature that don't have an intelligence, that lack understanding or intelligence, nonetheless act toward an end or goal. Lacking intelligence, then, they cannot direct themselves toward this goal. And think about it, even if you're talking modern-day sophisticated weapons that you say, well, a smart bomb can direct itself to its target. Yeah, it can direct itself to its target because it has been computer programmed by an intelligence to be able to do that, and designed and made to do that. So Aquinas here, rather than talking about the purposes that a thing is used for, he talks about an arrow reaching its end or goal as reaching the target, right? So the arrow doesn't have any intelligence, right? So he says an arrow by itself can't direct itself toward its target. It can't direct itself toward that end or goal, right, of aiming for the bullseye, it has to be directed to the target by an intelligent archer, by an intelligence.
You said Aquinas is the one saying all of this?
Yeah, this is Aquinas' fifth way. It's an argument. It's an early version of the design argument. And so he says, likewise, things in nature. And by the way, this is part of that that PowerPoint that also includes the ontological argument. At some point, I thought it was a good idea to put them all together on the same PowerPoint, and I probably should separate them. So at any rate, likewise, things in nature that fulfill a goal or purpose, then, he says, can't direct themselves to have this purpose by themselves. Now, of course, one of the points that evolution makes, and David Hume makes against the design argument, is whether there might be some internal mechanism in matter itself that does enable it to direct itself toward a goal or purpose. But Aquinas says if there's no intelligence, then something can't direct itself to serve a particular purpose. These things need to be directed by an intelligent designer. And so if you're talking things in nature, then the designer of those things, then he argues, would be God, as God is traditionally conceived. Well, Hume replies in a number of ways. We're going to look at him in much more detail. But from things in nature, we're supposed to conclude the existence of a perfect, supremely intelligent designer. In other words, for Aquinas, there's only one real option going on here, right? As far as who and what the designer of the universe would be. Right? It would be God as God is traditionally conceived in the Judeo-Christian tradition, right? With all of the attributes of God that we saw listed in the ontological argument, especially Descartes' version of it. But one of the things we're going to see that Hume points out is from the same premises, other possible conclusions can follow. That this is not the only possible conclusion, even though for Aquinas it would be the only live option. In the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint version, because I think 70 scholars translated it, when the ancient Hebrews talked about the religions of other surrounding cultures like Egypt and Mesopotamia and Persia, they related to these people and they used the word atheoi. In other words, to the ancient Hebrews, and this is carried on in the Christian tradition, the surrounding cultures may as well be, for all practical purposes, atheists. The word atheoi in Greek means without God. But you can say, well, wait a second. What do you mean they're atheists? They had all kinds of gods. You know, Egypt and Mesopotamia both had polytheistic systems like the Greeks did. What do you mean to call them atheoi? Atheists. Well, from the standpoint of traditional monotheism in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's only one existing God. And, you know, in other words, the polytheistic gods of the surrounding cultures just none of them were acknowledged to exist. And so if that's what these people believe, they may as well have been atheists from the standpoint of the Old Testament. And from the standpoint of somebody like Aquinas, there's really only one live option as far as who the designer of the universe is. And I don't think he would have been very impressed with Hume's speculations that, well, it's logically possible that there could be other conclusions about who the designer is. I think Aquinas would say, well, yeah, from a logical standpoint, maybe, but not in reality. But Hume thinks it's a genuine criticism of the reasoning used in the design argument that not just one conclusion is possible from the premises about who the designer of the universe might be. That, in other words, that the argument just by itself does not prove that the designer of the universe is, as Thomas Aquinas would say, God as God is conceived in the traditional Judeo-Christian religious framework. So let me pause this for right now. So this is what you find in your text, and let me see if I can. I'm just going to keep it at this size. I don't know if I can change it much, but here is Paley's version of the design argument. Okay, wait. In other words, you can see how it parallels, and this is what we saw in the video when you saw him crossing the field, the heath. Folks, would you put your phones away? Either that or just leave. All three of you, just leave if that's more important than go. I don't see people doing anything with their phones. I want them out of sight. I mean, I'm glad you think that whatever you're doing on those is more important than your college education. When you become one of the 85% who don't finish here, you can look back on that. I'd like to do some things to help keep as many people who come through my class in the 16 to 19% who do walk across the stage. And part of it is not putting up with stuff like that.
She said she was reading the text on her phone.
Well, okay, if you were, fine. If you're doing something associated with it, obviously I don't know that. Most people aren't. All right, so we're not going to read the entire thing, but he gives the essentials of his argument here at the beginning, right? A heath is kind of like a field, it's kind of a British terminology. If you're here, you cross a field. If you're in Scotland, you cross a heath. And so, see this idea of telos, or purpose, coming out in this paragraph. In crossing a heath, suppose I pitch my foot against a stone, says Paley, and were asked how the stone came to be there. He says, I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. Right? I mean, we don't think anything in particular of a stone we stumble across. And if we're looking for an explanation of how it came to be there, all of us would just assume, well, natural forces worked on it, and that, is here strictly as a result of natural forces. But Paley goes on. He says, but suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. He says, I should hardly think of the answer which I had before given, that for anything I knew the watch might have always been there. Right? And most of us are that way, right? I mean, even if we're walking across, the grass, and we see a pen there, right? And we say, well, they've lost it. No, I'll pick it up. But none of us thinks, well, okay, you got the grass and the stones around, and it must have been just natural forces in nature that caused this big pen to be there. None of us concludes that, right? We would also say, well, here's an implement that somebody made, right? Somebody dropped it or whatever, and that's the explanation for it being there. So Paley asks the rhetorical question, yet why should not this answer serve for the watch as well as for the stone? Namely, that it must have gotten there strictly through natural processes. And the answer he gives, can skip a little part of that. He says, it's for this reason and no other that when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive what we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose. And hence we get telos, right, the teleological argument, the design argument. For example, e.g. that they are so formed and adjusted as to produce motion, and that motion. Now he goes into much more detail than he needs to about the inner workings of the old-fashioned tick-tock kind of watch, right? The kind with wheels and springs and all that. But you can see the basic argument here, right? At least these are the premises. He's saying, well, what made the watch so special? Well, that it had parts that worked together to serve a purpose. Now, see, I like my selection of from Paley better than your authors, because at the end, if I could find it, I had a version that I highlighted this. Yeah. In chapter 6, and this is not in your book, but remember, what I'm reading this from is what's in supplemental readings on the internet. And so Paley gives us the conclusion he's looking for, right? He completes the analogy. Your author doesn't go into this that much. But I need to follow the Roman prescription of the dead speak only good, right? Unfortunately, I don't know whether it's heart attack or something, but Robert Solomon died either in his late 50s or early 60s, way before his time. Okay, you see him in those videos, but remember they were shot in like 1998 or so. So here's Paley's claim. Take something in nature that also has Oh, okay. Yeah, here's what I want. I cut out a little part from chapter 5. Every observation, Paley says, which was made in our first chapter, where we just read that about the watch, concerning the watch, he says may be repeated with strict propriety. This is flowery 19th century language. Concerning the eye. And he says concerning animals, concerning plants, concerning all the organized parts of the works of nature. Most philosophy books don't have any illustrations in them. I mean, in their originals. Paley's natural theology is kind of an exception to the rule. He has a lot of pen and ink drawings of various parts of animals and plants, so it's kind of an interesting book to look at. So he brings the analogy home, saying what we said about the watch may be repeated with things in nature like eyes and ears, namely that they have parts that work together to serve a purpose. And for Paley, the eye is a particularly good example of what he wants to show. So he says, were there no example in the world of contrivance is just another word for intelligent design, of contrivance except that of the eye. He says, it would alone be sufficient to support the conclusion which we draw from it as to the necessity of an intelligent creator. Right? So here he brings it home. He says, well, look, if the eye is like the watch in some respects, namely that it has, like the watch, intricate parts, a mechanism that functions together to serve a purpose, and if the watch needed a designer, well then surely the eye needed a designer, right? So there's kind of the specifics of the argument. So I recorded all this. That's why I use this rather than your book's version. This will be on the integrity recording. So look at that PowerPoint on Hume's criticisms of the design argument. It's kind of a long one, and we'll look at that and look at the negative part of the discussion. Okay, have a good weekend. I think the hurricane is supposed to track much farther out to sea than they were predicting a few days ago. So let's assume it's going to be business as usual on Monday. To check the internet or your phone if you have or app or media to see whether we're open. But I would assume that we're going to be. So. In fact, it's probably going to be worse today than it'll be during the hurricane. Okay, we'll see y'all.